She crawled into his bed, wearing almost nothing. Claiming it was an Apache ritual, he stayed silent. The storm descended from the mountains as if it had been waiting for night to fall. Wind clawed at the pine trees surrounding the small cabin, forcing them to bow and creak in protest, while rain struck the roof in heavy, relentless waves. He lay awake on the narrow bed, staring at the dark beams above him, listening to the familiar sounds of isolation. For years, nights like this had been his only company. Silence, broken only by nature, had become a kind of shield. Then he felt it, movement that did not belong to the storm. His eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the dying fire, and he saw her standing there, the Apache woman he had brought here days earlier after finding her exhausted near the river. She had spoken little since arriving, carrying herself with a quiet strength that made questions feel unnecessary. Now her long hair fell freely over her shoulders, and she wore almost nothing, not in a way that felt deliberate or tempting, but as if modesty itself had lost meaning in the face of something deeper. She did not look at him at first. Instead, she listened to the storm, her expression distant, her breathing steady. Slowly, without hesitation or fear, she moved closer and sat on the edge of his bed. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight. He did not move. He did not speak. After a moment, she lay down beside him, leaving space between them, careful and respectful. Her voice came softly, barely louder than the rain. She said it was an Apache ritual, something done when the spirit was restless, when fear clung too tightly to the heart. The presence of another human, she explained, could quiet the past without a single touch. He understood more from her tone than her words. This was not an invitation. It was a request for safety. The storm raged harder, thunder rolling through the valley, but inside the cabin everything slowed. He could sense her tension easing little by little, as if simply sharing the same space was enough. He kept his eyes on the ceiling, his hands still at his sides, aware that any movement might shatter the fragile trust she had placed in him. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time lost its shape. Her breathing eventually softened, falling into rhythm with his own. The fire burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the walls. He realized then that silence was not emptiness. It was restraint. It was respect. It was choice. When sleep finally came, it was the calmest he had known in years. Outside, the storm began to fade, retreating back into the mountains. Inside the cabin, two wounded lives shared a night that asked for nothing and took nothing, but still managed to change them both. Morning arrived quietly, as if the storm had taken all the noise with it when it left. Pale light slipped through the narrow window, touching the rough wooden walls and the floor worn smooth by years of solitude. He woke slowly, aware first of warmth, then of presence. She was no longer beside him. The space next to him was empty, neatly folded blanket resting where she had been. He sat up and saw her near the window, wrapped in another blanket, gazing outside as though reading something written in the trees and sky. There was no shame in her posture, no awkwardness. What had happened in the night did not trouble her. It had simply been. He stood, poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed for a brief second, light as a thought. She accepted the cup and nodded in thanks. "You didn't touch me," she said quietly, still looking out the window. He considered her words before answering. "I knew it wasn't what it looked like." That made her turn. For the first time since he had found her by the river, surprise crossed her face. In her experience, men often misunderstood closeness, mistaking silence for consent and vulnerability for weakness. She studied him now as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Our elders teach us," she said, "that fear leaves the body when it feels another heartbeat nearby. Not desire, not ownership, just life beside life." He nodded, understanding more than he could explain. Then the ritual worked. A faint smile touched her lips, brief but real. She took a sip of water, then wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. They moved through the small cabin without speaking much. He stirred the ashes in the fireplace, coaxing a small flame back to life. She straightened the space she had used, careful, respectful, as though she were a guest even now. Their silence was no longer heavy. It was shared, As the fire warmed the room, she began to speak of her people moving through the land, of traditions often misunderstood or mocked by those who did not listen. She spoke of loss without naming it, of running without explaining why. He did not interrupt. He had learned that listening was sometimes the only gift worth offering. When she finished, she looked at him again. "You stayed silent last night," she said. "That is why I knew I was safe." He felt something shift inside him at her words. Safety was a rare thing for both of them. Outside, the forest stood washed and renewed. Inside the cabin, two lives from different worlds rested in a fragile understanding, knowing that some connections were formed, not through action, but through restraint. That evening the fire burned brighter, fed by fresh wood and the calm that had settled between them. Outside, the forest still glistened from the storm, every leaf catching the last gold of the setting sun. The air felt washed clean, as though the night before had stripped something heavy from the world. He sat across from her, the flames dancing between them, not as a wall but as a quiet witness. She traced a pattern in the dirt floor with the tip of a stick, slow and deliberate. After a long pause, she began to speak again, this time with less distance in her voice. She talked about rituals that were never meant to be explained, only lived. How some were born from survival, others from grief, and a few from the simple need to remember what it meant to be human when everything else had been taken away. "People see only the surface," she said. "They judge what they do not understand." He looked into the fire, watching sparks rise and disappear. "I've lived most of my life being misunderstood," he replied. Silence became easier than explaining. She glanced up at him then, meeting his eyes fully. There was recognition there, not sympathy but understanding, the kind that didn't ask questions or demand answers. The fire popped softly. Shadows moved across the walls, stretching and shrinking like memories. She spoke of her childhood, of running barefoot across open land, of laughter that once came easily. Then her words slowed, growing heavier until they faded into silence again. He didn't push her to continue. Some stories revealed themselves only when they were ready. "You could have broken the ritual," she said suddenly. "Many would have." "I know," he answered, "but I chose not to." That choice lingered in the space between them. He realized then that restraint was not the absence of feeling, it was proof of it. Respect was not weakness. It was strength held carefully in check. As night settled, she stood and moved closer to the fire, warming her hands. He noticed how different she seemed now, steadier, lighter. The fear that had followed her into the cabin no longer clung to her movements. Whatever weight she had carried, part of it had been set down. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "I will have to leave." He felt the truth of it before she spoke the words. Some people were never meant to stay. They arrived to remind you of something, then moved on. "I know," he replied. They sat together until the fire burned low, sharing the quiet without needing to fill it. Outside, the forest breathed, alive and watchful. Inside, two souls from different worlds found peace not in what they took from each other, but in what they refused to take at all.